Margaret Hayes opened her door to 5 leather-clad strangers on the coldest night of the blizzard. Their faces hidden behind frozen beards and ice-crusted helmets, their massive frames filling her tiny doorway like shadows from a nightmare she should have feared. She invited them into her failing farmhouse anyway, shared her last can of chicken soup divided into 5 chipped bowls, offered the dying warmth of a furnace that coughed and sputtered its final breaths, never knowing that these rough-looking men shivering at her kitchen table were Jake Morrison and his 4 partners, the construction magnates who had built half the skyscrapers in the state, billionaires who had spent 20 years drowning in wealth but starving for a single genuine act of human kindness. She could never have imagined that her simple mercy, given when she had almost nothing left to give, would set in motion a transformation that would save her crumbling home, erase the debts that haunted her sleepless nights, and prove to 5 jaded souls that somewhere in the frozen heart of winter, true humanity still existed. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just 1 click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Margaret Hayes woke to the sound of her furnace coughing like a dying man, the same tortured wheeze that had haunted her mornings for the past 3 months. A mechanical death rattle she could not afford to silence. She was 72 years old, living alone in the farmhouse that had once rang with laughter and life, now silent, except for the creaking of old wood and the whisper of cold air slipping through cracks she had tried to seal with rolled towels and prayer. The mortgage payment was 3 months overdue. The certified letters from the bank stacked on her kitchen counter like accusations she could not answer, each one demanding $473 she simply did not have. She dressed in layers, pulling on 2 sweaters over her nightgown, then Thomas's old cardigan that still carried the ghost of his scent, wrapped herself in the afghan her mother had crocheted 40 years ago, and anything to keep the cold from settling into her bones. The medical bills from Thomas's final illness covered the kitchen table, $12,000 in debt that had swallowed her savings and her hope, bills for a life she could not save, despite every penny she had poured into his care. He had been gone for 2 years now, her Thomas, her companion of 50 years, the factory worker who had given her everything but money. And the house felt too large without him, every room an echo of what had been. She moved through her morning routine with quiet dignity, eating half a piece of toast for breakfast and saving the other half for dinner, rationing the food in her pantry like a general calculating supplies for a siege she knew she could not win. Still, when the stray tabby appeared at her back door, she opened the last can of tuna and divided it into the chipped saucer, watching the cat eat with a satisfaction that transcended her own hunger. She waved to her neighbor driving past, straightened her spine, maintained the appearance of a woman who was managing just fine. The old radio on the counter crackled with weather warnings, the meteorologist's voice urgent as he described the massive blizzard system moving toward them, the worst storm in 20 years bearing down on their small town. Margaret opened her pantry and stared at the nearly empty shelves. 1 can of chicken soup, 3 crackers, half a jar of instant coffee, and wondered how she would survive the winter, much less the storm. The weather reports grew more frantic as the afternoon darkened, the meteorologist's voice climbing an octave with each update, calling it the storm of the century, a blizzard that would bury the county under 3 feet of snow and unleash winds that could tear roofs from houses and lives from their moorings. Margaret moved through her preparations with the efficiency of a woman who had weathered many storms, filling the bathtub with cold water in case the pipes froze, gathering the candles she had saved from birthdays and power outages, lining them up on the kitchen counter like small soldiers preparing for battle. She checked her meager supplies again, counting and recounting as though the numbers might change, as though hope could multiply what remained. The lights flickered once, twice, and her heart clenched. But they held, the power straining but still flowing through the old wires. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the snow begin, small flakes at first, delicate and innocent, then growing thick and violent, accumulating on the ground with terrifying speed, erasing the world she knew beneath a blanket of white. She remembered winters when Thomas was alive, When their 2 children were small, remembered Emma and David building snowmen in the front yard, their laughter bright as bells, Thomas pulling them on sleds behind the old tractor, while she made hot chocolate in a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and warmth. Those children were grown now. Emma in California with her engineer husband and 2 kids Margaret had not seen in 3 years. David in New York chasing a career that left no time for visits or long phone calls. She picked up the phone and dialed Emma's number. Listened to it ring 6 times before voicemail clicked on, her daughter's cheerful voice asking her to leave a message. Margaret hung up without speaking, felt the isolation settle around her like the snow settling around her house. Cold and heavy and complete. The temperature dropped as evening approached, the thermometer outside the window reading 12 degrees and falling. The furnace in the basement struggling louder now, its mechanical groaning a constant reminder of its impending failure. She pulled Thomas's old work coat from the closet, the heavy canvas jacket he had worn for 30 years at the factory, wrapped herself in it like an embrace, and prepared to face the long night alone. The evening descended into darkness so complete that Margaret could not see beyond her own porch. The wind howling like something alive and furious, shaking the windows in their frames with a violence that made her flinch with each gust. She sat in her kitchen wrapped in Thomas's coat, listening to the radio predict the worst was yet to come, when she heard something impossible through the storm, the deep rumble of engines cutting through the wind, mechanical growls that grew louder and then stopped somewhere near her house. She stood and moved to the window, her heart beginning to pound, peered through the frost-covered glass, and saw nothing but swirling white chaos, and then shapes emerged from the blizzard like ghosts materializing from another world. 5 figures, massive and dark, moving toward her door. And then the pounding came, desperate fists hammering against the wood, voices shouting something she could not make out over the shrieking wind. Margaret crept closer and looked through the small window beside the door, saw leather jackets crusted with ice, faces hidden behind frozen beards, tattoos creeping up necks and across knuckles, men who looked like they had ridden out of her worst nightmares. Fear seized her throat, every instinct screaming at her to leave the door locked, to hide, to protect herself from these strangers who had materialized from the storm. But then she heard Thomas's voice in her memory, his gentle insistence that kindness was the only thing that mattered, that every person deserved dignity and help, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. She watched through the window as one of the figures stumbled and collapsed into the snow, watched his companions try to lift him, their movements slow and clumsy, and she understood they were not threatening her but dying in front of her, freezing to death on her doorstep while she debated her own fear. Margaret made her decision in the space of a heartbeat, unlocked the door and pulled it open against the wind, felt the cold slam into her like a physical blow, and shouted for them to come inside. They stumbled through the doorway one after another, bringing the blizzard with them, 5 enormous men covered in ice and snow, shaking violently, their lips blue and their eyes unfocused, hypothermia stealing their ability to speak or even stand. And Margaret pushed the door closed behind them and wondered what she had just invited into her home. Margaret moved with practical efficiency, despite the nervousness fluttering in her chest, pointing them toward the living room, where they could shed their frozen gear, her caretaker instincts overwhelming her fear as she assessed the danger in front of her. The leader was a broad-shouldered man with a graying beard matted with ice, his eyes sharp and intelligent despite the cold that gripped him, and he introduced himself through chattering teeth as Jake, then gestured to his companions with hands that trembled violently. Marcus was the youngest, maybe 30, with kind eyes now dulled by hypothermia, shaking so hard he could barely stand, his fingers white and waxy in a way that made Margaret's stomach clench with recognition of frostbite. Tommy stood silent and watchful, intense dark eyes tracking everything in the room, his quiet presence somehow louder than words, while Carlos bore tattoos that covered every visible inch of skin, intricate designs that crawled up his neck and across his knuckles, beautiful and intimidating in equal measure. Ray was the oldest besides Jake, maybe 60, with a weathered face that spoke of a hard life lived outdoors, and he was the first to apologize, his voice rough as gravel as he explained. Their bikes had died in the cold. Their phones were dead. They had gotten lost trying to find shelter and would have frozen to death, if not for her porch light. Margaret saw Marcus sway on his feet and made her decision, disappearing into the hallway and returning with every blanket and towel she owned, ordering them to get out of their wet clothes without a trace of the fear she had felt moments before. She moved to the kitchen and started heating water in every pot she owned, her mind already calculating what needed to be done first. Marcus's hands examined and elevated, warm fluids prepared, body temperatures raised slowly to avoid shock. The bikers watched her with something like wonder, their initial gruffness melting into respectful silence as this tiny elderly woman commanded them with the authority of a general, Jake catching her arm gently and asking why she had opened her door to strangers who looked like them. Margaret met his eyes and said simply that Thomas would have done the same. That people were people, regardless of leather and tattoos. And the tension in the room shifted into something softer, though they remained strangers huddled in close quarters, uncertain of what the long night would bring. Margaret returned to the kitchen and opened the cabinet, pulling out the last can of chicken soup with hands that trembled only slightly, and announced she would make them something warm to eat, her voice allowing no argument. The protests came immediately, Jake rising from his chair and saying they could see she had nothing, that they could not take her food, but Margaret silenced him with a look that could have stopped armies, repeating that Thomas would have done the same, and that was the end of the discussion. She heated the soup on the stove, the smell filling her small kitchen with a richness that made her own stomach ache with hunger, then divided it carefully into 5 portions, using the chipped bowls she had owned for 30 years, added the 3 crackers crushed into pieces, brewed tea from the last of her supply. The bikers ate in grateful silence, their heads bowed over bowls that must have seemed impossibly small to men their size, and Margaret watched them with satisfaction that transcended her own empty belly. Her kitchen told the story of her life in details she could not hide. The worn linoleum floor that had not been replaced in 40 years, the chipped mugs hanging from hooks Thomas had installed, the photographs on the refrigerator showing 2 children who had grown up and moved away, a younger Margaret and Thomas on their wedding day, faces bright with hope and love. The bikers noticed everything, their eyes moving across the poverty she lived in, the lack that surrounded them. And they exchanged glances heavy with meaning she could not read. Jake set down his empty bowl and asked about her husband, his voice gentle, and Margaret found herself talking about Thomas. 50 years of marriage to a factory worker who gave her everything but money, and his death 2 years ago, that had left her alone in a house too big and bills too large. The warmth slowly returned to the room as she spoke, not from the failing furnace that coughed and wheezed in the basement, but from something deeper. The warmth of shared stories and unexpected connection, strangers becoming something more in the intimate glow of candlelight and conversation. The lights flickered once more and then died completely, plunging the kitchen into darkness so absolute that Margaret heard someone gasp. And then she was moving by memory alone, reaching for the candles she had lined up earlier, striking matches that flared bright and temporary before settling into steady flames. She placed candles around the kitchen and living room, their golden light creating an intimate atmosphere that somehow made the space feel smaller and warmer, shadows dancing on the walls like old friends. The furnace gave one final shuddering cough and fell silent, its death coinciding with the power failure, and Margaret felt the temperature begin its inevitable drop, the cold creeping in through every crack and crevice like water finding its level. She directed everyone to huddle closer around the small space heater in the corner, the one that ran on the generator Thomas had installed years ago, and they arranged themselves in a tight circle, sharing body heat and blanket coverage without shame or hesitation. The stories began tentatively, Jake explaining they had been riding back from business up north, his voice carefully vague on the details, and Margaret noticed but did not pry, treating them with the same dignity she would want for herself. Tommy mentioned they had thought they could outrun the storm, a miscalculation that nearly cost them everything, while Carlos talked about the moment their bike started failing, engines seizing in the impossible cold, the terror of being stranded in the middle of nowhere with visibility dropping to 0. Marcus spoke for the first time since arriving, his voice stronger now, color returning to his face as the warmth and food worked their magic, admitting he had thought he was going to die out there in the snow, that he had made peace with it until they saw her porch light like a beacon cutting through the darkness. Ray said quietly that angels came in unexpected forms, and Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the sincerity in his weathered face. Outside, the snow continued its relentless accumulation, piling against the windows until only the top few inches of glass remained visible. The house becoming an island in a frozen sea, 5 strangers and 1 widow bound together by circumstance and choice, waiting for dawn. As the night deepened and the candles burned lower, the conversations shifted from surface pleasantries to something more vulnerable, the kind of honesty that emerges when strangers are trapped together in circumstances beyond their control. Carlos noticed the photograph on the refrigerator, the young Margaret and Thomas on their wedding day, and asked about their story with genuine curiosity softening his intimidating features. Margaret found herself sharing things she had not spoken aloud in years. How she had met Thomas at 17 in the high school cafeteria, married him at 20 against her parents' wishes, built a life of love and struggle that spanned 50 years. She talked about the factory closures that had stolen his job twice, the hard times when they ate beans and rice for months, the medical crisis that nearly bankrupted them when David was 10, but through it all they had each other. And that had been enough. Her voice broke when she reached his death. The cancer that took him piece by piece over 18 months. How she had held his hand at the end and felt her own life shatter into something she no longer recognized. The bikers listened with an attentiveness that surprised her. These rough men with their leather and tattoos leaning forward, their eyes soft with understanding, and Tommy spoke into the silence that followed, sharing how he had lost his father to a construction accident when he was 15, how the grief had nearly destroyed him, how he understood the particular emptiness she described. Ray talked about his own late wife, Sarah, gone 5 years now to a stroke that gave no warning, how he still reached for her in the night and found only cold sheets. Marcus admitted his mother had died when he was young, that he barely remembered her face but remembered the absence like a wound that never healed. Jake sat quiet through these confessions, but his eyes glistened in the candlelight. And Margaret understood that grief was the great equalizer, that loss transcended appearances and circumstances, binding them together in ways that comfort never could. The barriers that had existed when they first stumbled through her door were dissolving like snow in spring. Strangers becoming companions. Fear transforming into something that felt dangerously close to trust. The conversation naturally drifted toward her current situation, and Margaret tried to steer it elsewhere. But Jake had eyes that missed nothing, and he asked directly about the foreclosure notice he had seen on her kitchen counter. The certified letters from the bank that she had tried to hide beneath a dish towel. Margaret felt her face flush with shame, the admission of failure catching in her throat. But these men had shared their grief with her, and she owed them the same honesty. She told them she was 3 months behind on the mortgage, that the bank was threatening to seize the house, that the auction date had already been set for 6 weeks from now. The medical bills from Thomas's final months had bankrupted them. 18 months of treatments and hospital stays and medications that insurance would not cover. Every penny of their savings poured into keeping him alive for a few more weeks, a few more days, a few more hours. Her Social Security barely covered the utilities and food, left nothing for the mortgage payment of $473 that might as well have been $4 million for all her ability to produce it. Jake asked about her children, whether they could help. And Margaret straightened her spine with the pride that had carried her through 72 years, explaining that Emma and David had begged to send money. But she had refused because they had their own families and mortgages and struggles, and she would not become a burden to the children she had raised to be independent. The amount needed to save her home was $15,000, a sum so impossible she could not even conceive of where it might come from, and speaking it aloud made it real in a way that terrified her. The bikers fell silent, their faces unreadable in the flickering candlelight, and Margaret watched them exchange glances heavy with meaning, some unspoken communication passing between them that she could not interpret. She regretted telling them, regretted admitting her failure. But the words were out now and could not be taken back. Her poverty and desperation laid bare before 5 strangers who had their own problems and certainly did not need to carry the weight of hers. Jake shifted the conversation deliberately, his voice taking on a different tone as he started telling their story. Explaining that they were in construction, which was technically true, though he kept the details frustratingly vague. He said they had been working together for 20 years, the 5 of them, building something from absolutely nothing. Starting out with borrowed tools and more ambition than sense, they had scraped and struggled and fought their way up from the bottom. Tommy adding that there were years when they lived on job sites because they could not afford rent, Carlos mentioning the times they had gone hungry so they could buy materials for the next project. Margaret listened and sensed there was something more beneath the surface, some larger truth they were not quite sharing. But she did not push because she understood the need for privacy, for keeping certain things close to the chest. Marcus broke the tension with a joke about how their rough appearance scared most people, how little old ladies crossed the street when they saw them coming. Children stared with wide, frightened eyes. The restaurant hostesses tried to seat them in corners where they would not disturb the other customers. They discussed the judgment that came with their looks, the tattoos that marked them as dangerous, the leather jackets that made people assume criminality, and the motorcycles that confirmed every negative stereotype about men like them. Ray said it was exhausting being feared for existing, being treated like a threat, when all they wanted was to be left alone to live their lives. Margaret felt shame crawl up her spine and admitted quietly that she had been frightened when she first saw them through the window, that every instinct had screamed at her to keep the door locked, and she was ashamed of that fear now. Jake reached across and patted her hand with unexpected gentleness, telling her that most people would not have opened the door at all, that most people let their fear win, that she was the first person in longer than he could remember who had chosen compassion over self-preservation. And that made her extraordinary in ways she could not possibly understand. The conversation deepened into philosophy and human nature, Jake talking about how success had changed the way people treated them. Though he remained vague about what that success looked like, his voice heavy with something that sounded like regret. He explained that once you had something people wanted, everyone suddenly became your friend. Everyone had a pitch or an angle or a favor to ask, and genuine connection became impossible to find. Marcus nodded agreement, saying it was like being surrounded by people but completely alone, never knowing if someone liked you for yourself or for what you could provide them. Carlos shared about growing up poor in a neighborhood where violence was common and opportunity was rare, how he had clawed his way out but never forgotten where he came from, never forgotten what it felt like to be invisible or worse, to be seen only as a threat or a problem. Ray discussed the lost authenticity in the modern world, how everyone wore masks and played roles, how real human connection had been replaced by transactional relationships and surface-level interactions. Margaret listened to their cynicism and felt her heart ache for them, these successful men who sounded so fundamentally lonely. And she countered gently that kindness still existed in the world, you just had to look for it. Had to be willing to see it in small moments and quiet gestures. She said she believed in the goodness of people despite everything she had lost, despite the poverty that surrounded her, despite the bank threatening to take her home, because without that belief, life became unbearable and hopeless. The bikers stared at her with something like wonder, moved by her optimism in the face of circumstances that would have broken most people, her faith in humanity when she had every reason to abandon it. Tommy spoke for the first time in over an hour, his quiet voice cutting through the candlelit darkness, saying she might be the first real person they had met in years. The first one who wanted nothing from them, expected nothing, gave everything simply because it was the right thing to do. And Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks at the profound sadness in his words. The blizzard reached its peak fury near midnight, the wind screaming like something feral and desperate, shaking the entire house with such violence that the dishes rattled in the cabinets and the walls groaned under the assault. They heard the crack from the spare bedroom, sharp as a gunshot, and rushed to find the window had split down the middle, snow already pouring through the gap in a white torrent that threatened to bury everything. Everyone moved at once without discussion, Jake and Tommy dragging the old dresser across the floor to block the worst of it, Carlos and Ray gathering blankets and towels to stuff into the cracks, Marcus holding furniture steady while they worked. Margaret tried to help, pulling at a heavy chair that would not budge, and suddenly the room tilted and her vision grayed at the edges. Her age and exhaustion and hunger catching up with her all at once. Jake caught her before she hit the floor, his strong arms surprisingly gentle as he steadied her. His face creased with concern as he asked if she was all right. The men immediately surrounded her, insisting she sit down and rest, that they would handle the repairs and she had done enough, and Margaret protested that this was her house and her responsibility. But her voice came out weak and unconvincing even to her own ears. They would not hear her arguments, guiding her firmly but kindly to her chair in the living room, wrapping her in blankets like she was precious cargo, ordering her to stay put while they worked. She sat and watched these 5 enormous men, with their tattoos and leather and intimidating appearances, move through her home with unexpected tenderness, patching the broken window with the care of surgeons, their rough hands delicate as they arranged furniture and blankets to keep the cold at bay. Ray brought her water and made her drink it. Marcus checked her pulse with professional competence. Tommy added another blanket when he saw her shiver, and Margaret felt something shift in her understanding of the world. She had spent her whole life knowing that appearances meant nothing, that Thomas had taught her to judge people by their actions rather than their looks, but sitting there watching these supposedly dangerous men care for her and her home with such genuine concern, she understood the lesson in a deeper way, understood that kindness could wear any face and compassion could come from the most unexpected places. As the night wore on, Margaret's exhaustion crept over her like a heavy fog, her body finally surrendering to weeks of inadequate food and the stress of the evening's events, and she admitted in a small voice that she felt dizzy, that the room was spinning in ways it should not. The bikers were immediately alarmed. Marcus, kneeling beside her chair and revealing that he had EMT training, his hands gentle but efficient as he checked her pulse and looked into her eyes, asked questions about when she had last eaten a full meal. Margaret tried to remember and could not, the days blurring together into a haze of rationed crackers and half portions, and Marcus's face grew grim as he diagnosed low blood sugar, dehydration, and stress combining into a dangerous cocktail. Jake stood and moved to her kitchen, began opening cabinets and drawers with increasing urgency, and what he found made him go very still, the truly bare shelves telling a story more devastating than her words had conveyed. He returned to the living room and announced they had emergency rations in their bike packs outside. Supplies they always carried for long trips, and before Margaret could protest, Tommy and Carlos were already pulling on their frozen jackets and heading for the door. They disappeared into the blizzard that was still raging with undiminished fury, and Margaret tried to tell them not to risk themselves, but Jake told her quietly that they were not asking permission. The 2 men returned minutes later covered in fresh snow, carrying backpacks that they dumped on the floor, pulling out protein bars and bottled water and packets of nuts. Marcus unwrapped a protein bar and put it directly in Margaret's hand, his voice firm as he ordered her to eat. And when she hesitated, Jake added that they had plenty and she would be doing them a favor by accepting. She took a bite and then another, the food tasting better than anything she could remember, and they made her drink an entire bottle of water while they watched to ensure she finished it. The kindness overwhelmed her, these strangers who had nothing to gain from caring whether she lived or died. And Margaret began to cry, tears streaming down her weathered face as she tried to thank them, and found she had no words adequate for what she felt. Everyone settled in for the long night, the storm still raging outside with no sign of weakening, the wind howling against the house like it was trying to tear the structure from its foundation. Margaret dozed in her chair, the protein bar and water having stabilized her enough that exhaustion could finally claim her. And the bikers took turns keeping watch, rotating through the hours with military precision that spoke of long practice working together. They spoke in whispers when Margaret slept, discussing what they had witnessed in voices tight with emotion, the poverty she lived in, the dignity she maintained, the selfless act of opening her door when she had nothing to spare. Jake pulled the others aside into the kitchen where Margaret could not hear, his whispers intense as he picked up the foreclosure notice and studied it more closely, memorizing the bank's name, the account number, the exact amount owed. Marcus retrieved their bike batteries from the packs Tommy and Carlos had brought in. the heavy-duty power cells they used for long trips, and began charging their phones with the adapters they always carried. One by one, their devices came to life, glowing screens in the darkness, and Jake made the first call, his voice too low for Margaret to hear even if she had been awake. He spoke for 5 minutes, then ended the call and made another. Then another. A network of conversations that stretched into the early morning hours. Ray called someone named Patricia and spoke in coded language about properties and accounts, while Tommy texted rapidly with someone identified only as the lawyer in his contacts. Carlos made calls in Spanish, his voice urgent but controlled, discussing numbers and timelines with people who seemed to be waiting for his instructions. They worked with the efficiency of men executing a plan they had formed instantly and unanimously. No discussion needed because they all understood what needed to be done. Plans were being set in motion without Margaret's knowledge. Wheels turning in the darkness while she slept, wrapped in blankets and the kindness of strangers, unaware that her simple act of mercy was about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. Morning broke over a transformed world, the storm finally subsiding into gentle flurries, the wind dying to whispers after its night of fury, and Margaret woke to the smell of coffee filling her small house like a blessing. She opened her eyes to find Jake standing in her kitchen, having discovered her emergency stash of grounds she had been saving for a special occasion, and he handed her a chipped mug filled with coffee so hot and strong it made her eyes water with gratitude. The roads were still completely impassable. Snow drifted against her house in waves that reached halfway up the windows, but the worst had passed, and daylight revealed the scope of the blizzard's destruction. The bikers explained they needed to leave soon, to trek through the snow to where their bikes were abandoned, to call for help and begin the long process of digging out, and Margaret felt a sadness settle in her chest at the thought of them leaving. She moved to her pantry and pulled out what little remained. The protein bars they had given her the night before, a few packets of crackers, insisting they take them for their journey, despite their protests. The goodbyes began with an emotional weight that surprised everyone. Ray hugging her first and whispering thank you against her hair, Carlos kissing her cheek with tears in his eyes, Marcus holding both her hands and telling her she saved his life in more ways than one. Tommy simply nodded, his intense eyes speaking volumes his voice could not. And then Jake was last, standing before her with something unreadable in his expression. He asked for her phone number, said they wanted to check on her, make sure she was all right after they left. And Margaret wrote it on a scrap of paper torn from an old envelope, her handwriting shaky with emotion. They bundled up in their now dry leather jackets, pulled on gloves and helmets, transformed back into the intimidating figures who had appeared on her doorstep the night before, but Margaret saw them differently now, and knew she always would. Jake paused at the door and looked back at her, said something that sounded like a promise, though she could not quite make out the words. And then they were gone, 5 dark shapes trudging through the deep snow, disappearing into the white landscape, and Margaret stood at her window watching until she could no longer see them, feeling more alone than she had in 2 years. The bikers prepared for their trek through the snow, checking their gear and steeling themselves for the journey to their bikes and then to town, however many miles that might be through the deep drifts, and each took time to thank Margaret personally, with embraces that carried more weight than words could express. Marcus went first, wrapping his arms around her small frame and saying she had saved his life, not just from the cold but from something deeper he could not name. His voice breaking on the last word. Ray was next, his weathered face wet with tears as he told her she had reminded him why kindness mattered, why getting up each morning and trying to be good was worth the effort, even when the world seemed determined to crush that goodness out of existence. Carlos held her like she was his own grandmother, whispering gracias over and over against her white hair, and Tommy squeezed her hand with such intensity she felt the emotion radiating from his silent form. Jake was last, and he took both her hands in his, held them with a gentleness that contradicted his imposing size, looked directly into her eyes, and said she would not be forgotten. Those exact words, "You will not be forgotten." With such conviction that Margaret felt something shift in the air between them. There was something in his eyes she could not read, some promise or plan she did not understand, But before she could ask, he was turning away and leading the others out into the white landscape. Margaret stood at her window and watched them trek through snow that reached their knees. 5 dark figures moving across an impossible terrain, growing smaller and smaller until they disappeared completely into the distance. And she felt the profound loneliness return like a physical weight settling on her shoulders. The house seemed emptier than ever before, the silence more complete, every room echoing with the absence of the life that had filled it for one night. She turned from the window and saw something on the kitchen table. A business card Jake must have left while she was saying goodbye to the others, plain white with simple black text that read Morrison Construction Group and a phone number beneath it. Nothing more. And Margaret picked it up and wondered who these men really were, what they really did, and whether she would ever see them again. The days passed slowly, and Margaret tried to return to the rhythm of her normal life, rationing the food the bikers had left her, watching the snow melt gradually under a weak winter sun, but everything felt different now. The house haunted by the memory of 5 strangers who had become something more. The call from the bank came on a Tuesday morning, a woman's crisp professional voice informing her that the foreclosure was proceeding as scheduled. The auction would take place in 2 weeks, and she needed to vacate the property within 30 days of the sale. Margaret thanked the woman for calling and hung up, then sat at her kitchen table and began the process of accepting what she could not change. She started packing slowly, wrapping her few precious possessions in newspaper, boxing up the photographs and the dishes and the Afghans her mother had made, each item a memory she was leaving behind. She called her daughter Emma in California and said it was time, that she was ready to move west and live in the guest room Emma had offered so many times, and Emma cried on the phone and promised to buy the plane ticket immediately. Margaret pulled out the business card Jake had left and dialed the number with trembling fingers, let it ring 12 times before accepting that no one would answer, then tried again the next day and the day after that with the same result. She assumed they had forgotten her in the way people forget chance encounters, moved on with their lives and their construction business, and she was not bitter because she understood that one night of connection did not obligate them to anything more. Just sad that she would never know what happened to them, whether Marcus's hands had healed, whether they had made it home safely. She made peace with losing the house Thomas had carried her over the threshold of 50 years ago, told herself that memories could not be seized by banks, that she would carry him with her wherever she went. The final week arrived, and Margaret packed the last of her belongings, said goodbye to the stray cats, prepared to leave the only home she had ever known. The knock on the door came on a Monday morning, 5 days before the auction. And Margaret almost did not answer because she assumed it was the bank's appraiser coming to assess the property value, but something made her open the door anyway, and there they stood. Jake and Marcus and Tommy and Carlos and Ray, the 5 bikers from the blizzard. But they were not alone. Behind them stretched a convoy of trucks and vans, construction crews climbing out of vehicles, equipment being unloaded, at least 20 people moving with purposeful efficiency across her snow-covered yard. Margaret stood frozen in confusion, her mind unable to process what she was seeing, and Jake stepped forward with a smile that transformed his entire face and asked if they could come in. They filled her small kitchen once more, but this time there was an energy about them, an excitement barely contained, and Jake took her hands the way he had the morning they left and said it was time to tell her the truth. Morrison Construction Group was not just a company, it was their company, he explained. The 5 of them were the Morrison brothers and partners, though only Jake and Ray were actually brothers, men who had built a $300 million construction empire from nothing over 20 years of relentless work. Margaret felt her legs go weak and sat down hard in her chair, unable to comprehend the numbers he was saying, and Marcus knelt beside her and explained they had started with borrowed tools and a dream, never forgot where they came from, never forgot what it felt like to be poor and desperate and judged. Tommy said they had spent years wealthy but hollow, surrounded by people who wanted their money or their influence, searching desperately for something authentic and real in a world that felt increasingly fake. Carlos added that they had tested people over the years, appeared in their leather and tattoos to see who would treat them with dignity. And nearly everyone had failed that test, had turned them away, or called the police, or served them with suspicion and contempt. Jake's voice broke as he said, that night in the storm was the first time in years someone had helped them expecting absolutely nothing in return, that Margaret had shared her last food with strangers who looked dangerous, had opened her home when she had every reason to protect herself. And that kind of genuine kindness was worth more than all the money they had made. Jake leaned forward and said with absolute conviction that they were not giving her charity, that she needed to understand this was not pity or a handout. They were paying a debt she did not even know she was owed. She had given them everything when she had nothing, he explained. Shared her last can of soup with 5 strangers, opened her door when any rational person would have kept it locked, and in doing so she had shown them that humanity still existed in a world they had almost given up on. Ray added that she had saved more than Marcus's life that night. She had saved all of them from the cynicism that was slowly killing their souls, reminded them why they had worked so hard to build their empire in the first place, to help people, to make a difference, to matter. The full house renovation was starting immediately, Jake announced, gesturing to the crews outside who were already unloading equipment. They would install a new roof and a new furnace and completely redo the plumbing and electrical systems that were decades past their safe lifespan, replace every window, and repair every structural issue the house had accumulated over 70 years. Tommy said the mortgage had been paid in full that morning. The bank had already processed the payment and sent confirmation. The house was hers, free and clear, with no debt attached, and they had the paperwork in the truck to prove it. Marcus stepped forward and handed her an envelope, his hand steady now, completely healed from that night of frostbite, and told her to open it. Margaret's fingers shook as she pulled out a check, stared at the number written there. $50,000 made out to her name, and Marcus said it was for expenses and peace of mind, for food and bills and whatever she needed to live with dignity. The crews were already starting work outside, the sound of hammers and saws filling the air, and Margaret tried to speak, tried to find words for the gratitude and disbelief and overwhelming emotion crashing through her. But nothing came out except a sob. She collapsed forward and Jake caught her, held her while she cried, her small body shaking with the force of tears she had held back for 2 years. And the 5 men surrounded her like a wall of protection, these bikers who were secretly millionaires, these strangers who had become her salvation. The weeks passed in a blur of construction noise and constant activity, Margaret watching in amazement as her crumbling farmhouse transformed into something she barely recognized. Something beautiful and solid and permanent. The new kitchen gleamed with modern appliances and countertops. The bathroom had been completely rebuilt with safety bars and a walk-in shower. The heating system hummed efficiently instead of coughing its death rattle. And solar panels covered the roof, generating more power than she could ever use. Every structural issue had been addressed. Every crack sealed. Every rotting board replaced. New windows installed that actually kept the cold outside where it belonged, fresh paint covering walls that had not seen color in 20 years. The garden had been restored and prepared for spring. Beds built and soil enriched. A small greenhouse erected so she could grow vegetables year-round. The community learned the story when the local news covered it. A human interest piece about the widow who helped 5 strangers and discovered they were construction millionaires, and suddenly Margaret became a symbol of kindness rewarded. Proof that good things happened to good people. The phone rang constantly with interview requests and invitations to speak at churches and community centers. Neighbors who had never spoken to her before appeared with casseroles and offers of friendship, and Margaret protested the attention even as she felt the loneliness that had haunted her for 2 years finally begin to lift. The bikers visited regularly, at least once a week, sometimes more, bringing groceries and stories and laughter that filled the house with life again. They had become like family. These 5 rough men who called her mom and fixed things without being asked, and sat at her new kitchen table drinking coffee and talking about everything and nothing. Her children came home, Emma flying in from California with her husband and kids, David driving up from New York, both of them crying as they toured the transformed house and hugged the men who had saved their mother. There was reconciliation in those visits. Gratitude expressed and accepted, the distance that had grown between them over the years. Shrinking as they rebuilt their connections over meals, Margaret cooked in her beautiful new kitchen, and she realized that the bikers had not just saved her house, they had saved her family. Given them all a reason to come together again. 6 months later, spring arrived in full bloom, transforming Margaret's yard into a riot of color and life. Tulips and daffodils pushing through the rich soil the construction crews had prepared. And her house had become something she never expected, a gathering place for the community. She hosted meals every Sunday, cooking in her beautiful new kitchen for anyone who needed food or company, or simply a reminder that kindness still existed in the world. And there was always enough now, her pantry stocked and her refrigerator full. Abundance replacing the scarcity that had defined her life for so long. The bikers had established a foundation in her name, the Margaret Hayes Foundation for Seniors in Crisis, dedicated to helping elderly people facing foreclosure or medical debt, or the crushing poverty that came from outliving their savings. And Margaret volunteered her time telling her story at fundraisers and community events, inspiring others to open their doors and their hearts to strangers who might need help. Her simple act on that blizzard night had created ripples that spread far beyond her small farmhouse, changing multiple lives in ways she was still discovering, elderly people across the state receiving help because 5 millionaires had remembered what genuine kindness looked like. Jake visited on a warm April afternoon, and they sat together on her new porch, rocking gently in chairs Tommy had built with his own hands, watching the world wake up from winter's grip, and he thanked her again for giving them back their humanity, for reminding them that wealth meant nothing without purpose, that success was hollow without connection. Margaret reached over and squeezed his calloused hand and told him they had given her back her faith, not just in people but in the possibility that goodness could triumph over circumstances, that one small act could change everything. Her house stood strong and beautiful behind them. Once crumbling and nearly lost, now a symbol of what kindness could build when it met gratitude, when compassion was answered with action, when strangers chose to see each other as human beings worthy of dignity and love. So remember this story the next time you see someone who needs help, the next time fear tells you to lock your door and protect yourself. Remember that you never know who you might be helping, what difference your kindness might make, what ripples might spread from a single act of mercy on the coldest night of winter. And choose compassion over fear. Choose humanity over judgment, because that choice might just save more than one life. It might save your own soul in the process. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that goodness still exists, that miracles happen, that one person's kindness can change the world.